Snow is removed. Roads are paved. Traffic lights operational. Whether for work or play, getting where we need to go has never been easier. When we're busy doing what needs to get done each day, it's easy to forget how all of this is made possible. No, it's not magic. It's a dedicated team working for you. Learn more about cities and towns in Colorado at coloradocitiesandtowns.org.
You'd say I'm getting nowhere. In my dreams, you always come around.
Urban drainage and then from city staff. And the intention for this evening is to give you a primer and background on floodplain. We're not necessarily going to go into it tonight, but one of the sections of the code that we handed out for you is if there's any development that happens within a floodplain in Littleton, it does have to come before the Planning Commission, and it's called a special exception. So we wanted to give you some background on floodplain and just to give you an awareness around that. So with that, I'll turn it over. You guys let's just go around the room and introduce ourselves.
I suppose I need to have this closer. I'm Teresa Patterson with Urban Drainage and Flood Control District. I'm a project manager there at the district. I work a lot with developers in the development community and reviewing their plans and their proposals and implementation of stream improvements and work in the floodplain.
I'm Terry Fade. I'm also a project manager with the Urban Drainage and Flood Control District, and I work mainly with the floodplain delineations, with the flood hazard area delineation studies, and also with the Federal Emergency Management Agency programs for letters of map change when people want to change something with the floodplain, if they've done a development and need a map change. And also I work with FEMA on, and the local governments on getting our local floodplains on the flood insurance rate maps. So we I work mainly in the floodplain end of things right now.
I missed what district you're with.
The Urban Drainage and Flood Control District?
Urban Drainage and Flood Control.
Yeah.
Andrew Graham, Planning Board.
Kurt Samuelson, Planning Commission.
Bruce Stallman, Planning Commission.
Karina Alrod, Planning Commission.
I'm Brian Corbett.
Fred Bromberger, I'm an engineer for City of Littleton Public Works Department, and I'm filling in as the acting floodplain administrator because the city engineer position is vacant, who is also the floodplain administrator.
R.C. Miles, I'm on the Planning Commission.
Anastasia, Urban Development Services Manager in the Community Development Department.
And Jocelyn Mills, Community Development. So with that, we'll turn it over to you ladies and take it from there.
Great, thank you.
Okay. We have a short video that kind of gives an overview of what the floodplains are and kind of how we think they can benefit the communities.
Flooding is the most common and most costly natural disaster because more people are living in the floodplains. Floodplains are low-lying areas along rivers and streams that are normally dry but can occasionally flood. While flooding can be costly, we can work together to prevent its negative impacts by using the floodplains as a community asset. That means using the floodplains for water, open spaces, parks, and trails. Using the floodplains as a community asset will create beauty.
Oh, see, I knew I was going to screw that up. I just can't leave well enough alone. Oh, I really did it. I'm sorry. I'm just showing how vulnerable you are.
Terry, just a further clarification on the district. Is that a Colorado? Is that a state level?
It's a special district in the Denver metro area. Yeah. And so we have 40, we represent 40 communities, 7 counties and 33 incorporated entities.
By the way, this is, pulled up that slide on
Right, so
who
this
we are.
is our district. And it's about 1,600 square miles and about 2.8 million people. We have about 1,600 miles of drainage way in our area, and our annual precipitation is at 14.5 inches per hour, basically.
So we are an organization that was enacted by state
legislation.
There we go.
Yeah.
State legislation in 1969 for the protection of the citizens against flood risks. And since that time, we have grown from a 4-man shop into 40 people that now work with all of the local governments throughout our district to protect people, manage floodplains, do really good stream improvement work to enhance our stream corridors and make them an asset and protect people at the same time. All right, now see, watch. I'm going to do this again. We're going to go back to our video. I'm going to try not to screw it up this time.
Flooding is the most common and most costly natural disaster because more people are living in the floodplains. Floodplains are low-lying areas along rivers and streams that are normally dry but can occasionally flood. While flooding can be costly, we can work together to prevent its negative impacts by using the floodplains as a community asset. That means using the floodplains for water, open spaces, parks, and trails. Using the floodplains as a community asset will create beautiful places near which people want to live and work. It will save the community money as well as protect businesses, people, and their homes. Join us to use floodplains as a community asset. We can all work together to use the floodplains as a community asset. Local governments want development because it brings jobs and taxes to help their communities grow and thrive. But wise use of the floodplains can create jobs and boost the local economy too. For example, Denver, Colorado is set to develop the South Platte River Corridor to include retail and residential development, as well as open spaces and parks. Over the next 20 years, this is expected to generate 22,000 jobs, $550 million in additional economic benefit to Denver residents and businesses, and up to $4.3 million annually in the new revenue for the city. And in Texas, the San Antonio River has experienced flooding for centuries. But with the public's support, San Antonio is working on a plan to restore historic and natural resources, promote economic development, and provide the community with a resource they can access and use.
It was a very pleasant surprise, and it's one of the most incredible things I've seen in my life, actually, to see what looked like a drainage ditch suddenly become a really nice city park, and it's just a block away from home.
By wise use of floodplains, local governments can create communities where people want to live and keep people safe from the impacts of flooding. It makes sense for local governments to use floodplains as a community asset. Join us. Developers can use the floodplains wisely and continue their business's success. Wise use of the floodplains helps developers have lower construction, operation, and maintenance costs. For example, outside of Chicago, Prairie Crossing included 350 acres of open space for farms, wetlands, and parks, saving $1 million in infrastructure costs through smart design. Wise use of the floodplains also helps developers make more money and better market their development to residents and businesses. In Charlotte, North Carolina, developers found massive success in marketing their mixed-use project near the Little Sugar Creek Greenway. The 15-mile-long greenway attracted residents and businesses to the area. The Metropolitan luxury condo development next to the greenway sold to investors for $94.5 million. It makes sense for developers to use floodplains as a community asset. Join us.
We go YouTube surfing forever. Go back to.
Okay. So like Teresa said, we were created in 1969, and it was really in response to the 1965 flooding that occurred in the Denver area. And because our watersheds go through several communities, we're the district that works with the multi-jurisdictional communities on the floodplains. And
You know, it's really, so we are taped and it's just hard for people to hear, so you don't have to, if you don't mind talking into
All right.
that. Or pull it closer to you, it's fine.
Okay. So we work with the local governments on getting multi-jurisdictional solutions to a lot of the flood control and drainage problems in the area. And we typically have a two-pronged approach to that. The first is preservation, so people staying out of the floodplain so that we don't have future flooding problems in response to development, and then also having a remedial program where we do design and construction projects to mitigate any kind of flood damages that are occurring from existing floodplains, from existing developments. So the Urban Drainage and Flood Control District is responsible for producing flood insurance or floodplain studies local floodplain studies in the Denver metro area. And we work with the communities. It's at the community's request on doing the floodplain studies, and then we send them to the Colorado Water Conservation Board for designation, and then those floodplains can be used for floodplain regulation in the metro area. We also have a memorandum of understanding with FEMA that we can take our local floodplain studies and get them put on the FEMA flood insurance rate maps and incorporated it into the FEMA flood insurance studies through a physical map revision process. So, okay. So what is a floodplain? A floodplain is an area that's inundated with water after a storm event. And for regulatory purposes, that's based on the 100-year or the event that has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. And it's also known as the base flood event. And the floodway is the channel and adjacent areas that needs to remain open to allow that 100-year or base flood event to pass through an area without causing more than an acceptable rise in water surface elevation. And in Colorado, that rise is 1/2 foot for a floodway. So at the federal level, the Federal Emergency Management Agency regulation is through the National Flood Insurance Program, and that sets minimum standards for floodplain regulation in the United States. And the Colorado Water Conservation Board here has their own rules and regulations that set forth floodplain regulation based on some higher standards for Colorado. And then the local government have the local floodplain ordinances and land use regulations. But they all have the common goal of protecting people and property from damage and reducing future flood losses. So the difference between the federal and state floodplain rule regulation is basically a freeboard issue, and that is that the National Flood Insurance Program requires finished floor elevations for new buildings to be built at or above the base flood elevation or the 100-year floodplain elevation. And the state requires those finished floors to be at least 1 foot above that base flood elevation, and for critical facilities, it's required to be at least 2 feet above the base flood elevation. They also have their floodways based on a 1/2 foot flood surcharge, whereas the minimum national standard is to allow encroachment to cause a 1 foot rise in water surface elevation. So it's a wider floodplain. The community ends up being the ones to do the floodplain regulation at the local level. And they do this through the adoption and enforcement of local ordinances, a floodplain ordinance that either meets or exceeds the criteria or the standards in both the National Flood Insurance Program and the Colorado rules and regulations for regulatory floodplains in Colorado. They also issue all the floodplain development permits and make the floodplain decisions. So by promoting good floodplain management, we get that through the local governments. So development and floodplain management, development can have a significant impact on a watershed when it occurs. And mainly, it increases the amount of impervious area so that less water can soak into the ground, and you end up with more water on the surface or more runoff that collects in different places and can cause flooding problems. And the way that communities, the tools that they have to regulate against that are through the local ordinance, the building codes, and the floodplain preservation, as well as membership in the community rating system. And that's an incentives program by the Federal Emergency Management Agency to encourage floodplain management at the local level to be based on higher standards. And in exchange, there's the reduction in flood insurance premiums for residents in that community that have flood insurance. So basically, we're all working towards a more resilient community. And what that means is you're minimizing the loss of life and the loss of property damage, as well as minimizing economic loss by allowing a community to recover more quickly after a flood event, and also reducing ecological damage by promoting healthy stream corridors that are available for a multiple number of uses by the public. And now I'll turn it over to Teresa to talk a little bit more about the positive impacts of development.
So I let Terry take on all the technical stuff, and now I get to talk to you about how we use these floodplains in our communities to be more than just a regulatory hurdle to get through. So there are a lot of positive flood risk impacts that can happen during a development. So this is an example. This is Westerly Creek in the Stapleton redevelopment area. And I'm going to talk about this quite a bit because they're a really good example of fantastic use of floodplains as a community asset, because floodplains become these multi-use urban corridors. And then, so this is what it looks like on a day-to-day basis. And then when you have a large storm event, it looks more like this, where the large portion of the park area is underwater. Yet you can see the houses adjacent to that are nowhere near the floodplain location. So they're at a much lower risk than it may appear. So with floodplains and land management, the first thing we try to do is avoid the floodplains if possible, and then minimize our impacts to them when necessary. And then in the end, we always want to mitigate to offset the effects of development. As Terry was talking, when you develop, you impact our streams. No matter what you try to do, for the most part, you're impacting the streams because the water cannot soak into the ground the way it used to, and all of that water has to go somewhere. And usually it ends up in our storm sewers, which are then piped directly to the stream network. And then they see more frequent floods. And so we have all of these effects of development that occur in our streams. And so one of the things that urban drainage tries to do is try to do the most responsible development so that we're not all encumbering taxpayer dollars to go fix something that somebody else has caused, I guess. Let's just say that. So develop near streams, we want to make sure, number one, that we do not cause an increase in the flood risk. We don't want to build houses that are going to put people in harm's way. So we want to make sure that the engineers are doing their job and doing their due diligence to make sure that they're providing a minimum level of safety to those properties. One way to do that is also to build elevated. As Terry was talking about freeboard, the minimum national standard is to have no additional elevation above what we consider the 100-year flood elevation. And the state has said that it is important enough to our state for resiliency that we have to have at least a foot of freeboard on any house or any building that's built, that's now built, has to be above that 100-year floodplain. And the local floodplain ordinance should say the same thing. I didn't want to put words in your mouth in case that wasn't the case. It should be. So So you've seen this picture before. So we want sustainable streams. This is Stapleton Greenway. This is along Westerly Creek. And in this picture, you can see somebody and their dog really enjoying the park. And in 2013, this is what it looked like. And one of the things I want you to note as we go back to that picture, this picture was taken within days of the flood. And you can see that the entire thing bounced back. The trail is still intact, the bridges are still intact, the vegetation barely sustained any sort of damage because it was designed properly with flooding in mind. So this, again, is the Westerly Creek area. This is the Stapleton Airport area. This picture, I know it's a black and white, but Google Earth says it's 1999, so it's not that old. But you can see that's where Westerly Creek was. So much of Westerly Creek was piped below ground underneath of the runways. And then what was left was just, kind of a straight, not really what I would call a creek, but more of a flood channel beyond that. This picture was taken in 2013, I think is when I captured this. And they went back, so let me go back. So they took this area and they completely redeveloped it, put a residential housing development in. I think, what did I say, like 4,700 mixed land use throughout Stapleton redevelopment area. And they made this beautiful corridor for Westerly Creek that is now a creek. They've daylighted the creek. It's a channel that runs above ground. They've created this beautiful green space with trails and other amenities. And the properties that are directly adjacent to that have a premium in their values. So they were able to sell them for an extra premium, and those property values are much higher because they back to this fabulous neighbor. So you can see before, after, good stuff, right? So this is what it looks like on the ground. You can see that the houses are there. You can see there's water, lovely open space, not a groomed grass park per se. A lot of amenities, bridges, this beautiful low flow channel, great wetland vegetation, and the houses have this in their backyard. Just a completely different transformation from what was there previously. Here's another example, the preserve at Weaver Creek. As you can see on the left, there was Weaver Creek runs through there, and they built as close to the floodplain as they could, but they stayed out of the floodplain that was there and built flood control walls so that they could build these high density area. This happened to be an infill project, so they were kind of landlocked already, and they were doing the best with the land that they had to make it economically feasible. Here are some more pictures of what that looks like. On the left, you see a lot of wetlands and riparian vegetation. The creek, that sidewalk actually functions as in the flood control world, what we call a grade control structure to keep the channel at the current geometry that it is, so it doesn't change much from what you see at that particular location. And then you can just see a lot of riparian vegetation and natural open space through there.
Where's Weaver Creek? Where is that?
It's in Lakewood. I don't know specifically. That's okay. Where that is, but that's in the city of Lakewood. Okay. Rock Creek Ranch is in Superior, and I just wanted to show you an example of preservation of a riparian corridor, being able to put in trails and other amenities. You can see the ball fields in the background. So they are inundated during a infrequent flood event, but yet that's a dual use for that land. Because you can't put a house there, but ball fields kind of recover pretty quickly. So those are good uses, multi-purpose uses of those areas. And then here are a few examples along Goldsmith Gulch. These are older areas of Denver, but again, you've got a nice riparian corridor, vegetation, floodplain, the channel, and you've got development still working around those areas. One of the nice things about this particular one is they worked around the floodplain instead of making the floodplain go where they wanted it to, or making the creek go where they wanted it to. There are pros and cons to both of those approaches, and sometimes it makes sense to move those floodplains or capitalize on some of the shallower areas of those floodplains to preserve some of the better, more valuable areas, as far as valuable from a stream health and habitat perspective. Here's another example of Goldsmith Gulch. This is more of a groomed turf grass park. We're kind of moving away from this sort of model, but this is an older park and it's functioned very well. Another one, Goldsmith Gulch and Hutchison Park. You can see on the right there, they've got a boardwalk type trail that goes through there, really bringing people down to nature.
And when you say moving away from, thank you for the questions.
That's fine, go ahead.
Moving away from that model, why are you moving away from that model?
It's a lot of maintenance. It's really high maintenance. The parks people have to buy into, going in and maintaining those. Also, turf grass, from a water quality perspective, doesn't offer as much benefit. Well, that doesn't benefit. It introduces a lot of nutrients that you don't get when you have just an open space with really good native grasses. The other thing, too, is that turf grass only goes so deep into the ground, and a lot of what holds these stream corridors together is the vegetation. And those native grasses don't go 3 inches below ground, they go feet below ground. And when the floods come through, that root mass is what holds streams together and helps armor the stream corridor a lot better than mowed grasses, or even concrete isn't good because it's only so thick, and if it gets compromised, then there's nothing holding it together after that. We're also learning some very valuable lessons from if you put a lot of rock in a creek setting, that you've now set it up for an area that it depends on that rock. If you've engineered it to depend on the rock to do its job, then you're constantly maintaining the rock. Versus if you do a more natural stream design, you are allowing the stream to adjust as it needs to bounce back and it's resilient to floods. Much like you saw in Westerly Creek, there wasn't a lot of hardened stuff, and it's done very well.
Thank you. So questions, anyone? Commission?
Can you speak to what happens to properties when the floodplains change, when you all update maps and such?
Yeah. So when we update maps, and there are several map revisions that are ongoing even at this time, a lot of things that might change would be that we have better information, we have more detailed topographic information, or more detailed technology to analyze the floodplain. And you'll end up with areas that some floodplains are smaller and some floodplains are wider. And for floodplains that are wider, if you have an existing development, that the homes are impacted by that floodplain, or the property is touched by that floodplain, then there's a chance that if it's a federal floodplain on the flood insurance rate maps, as opposed to just on our local maps, that there would be a potential mandatory flood insurance purchase if the homeowners had a federally backed mortgage, or the business had a federally backed mortgage on that. So even technically, that's only required if there's if the structure is touched by the floodplain. If the lot is touched by the floodplain, sometimes a mortgage company will require mandatory flood insurance anyway. But a homeowner can get a letter of map amendment that is an elevation certificate. Basically, they need a surveyor to show that their finished floor elevation is above the 100-year water surface elevation, and then they get a letter. It doesn't actually result in a little circle being drawn on the floodplain map, but it provides them with documentation that they are above that flood elevation. Does that help? Okay.
Couple questions. A lot of property and casualty insurance companies are revisiting some of their actuarial models with respect to climate change. Ostensibly, your 100-year flood may be changing if some of the parameters that go into the climate models are changing. So how is that impacting what you guys are doing? And more to the point, how should it be impacting land use issues in Littleton?
Okay. First of all, the flood hazard area delineation studies that we do, the local floodplain studies, are based on future development conditions. So they assume a full build out of the basin based on land use maps from the communities. We use those for determining that. The National Flood Insurance Program is using maps that are based on existing conditions flooding. So existing conditions development. So you may have an area that's not in a floodplain now, but if it develops, then you're going to have a wider floodplain, and some areas then can end up in a floodplain when they weren't before. And that's what we try to avoid by staying out of the floodplain. The higher standards that the Colorado Water Conservation Board has implemented are also kind of speaking to that in kind of, there's a lot of uncertainty in a floodplain. It doesn't just follow the lines that we put on the map, of course. And there are a lot of different, I guess, impacts to the properties on that. So because of the uncertainty, that's why the Colorado Water Conservation Board is calling for that additional freeboard, that additional foot above the 100-year water surface elevation. There are some communities and local governments can actually invoke even higher standards as part of their floodplain ordinance to accommodate that and look at maybe a 2-foot requirement. There are some communities that do that as well. But that's kind of how we've been dealing with the future flood risk issue, is by using fully developed flood hydrology conditions so that we get the fully developed discharges that would be used. And then we're also looking at that additional freeboard as a protection for the state requirements that we have.
I'd also like to add that we, from time to time, revisit the models that we use to quantify the amount of water that we would expect to see. And we use actual stream gauge information that we have throughout the metro area to inform those models. And so the flow that we may use to design a particular bridge, let's say, on a street, is based on hydrology models that are the most current that we have available. Let's just say that. And then then maybe in 20 years, we go back and we recalibrate based on more stream gauge information, more historic information, to know that that's more informed than it was before. So we're always using the best available information at the time that work is being done. So the time that the studies are being done or the time that a design is being completed, we're always using, to the best of our knowledge, the best available information.
And then I guess the other second question I wanted to ask, and I appreciate your thoughts on that. We've got a pretty good sized parcel of land southwest. It's probably the largest undeveloped parcel left in the city. roughly the southwest corner of Mineral and Santa Fe, and it is in the floodplain. And I guess it's got a zoning on it that probably dates from a zoning overlay on it that probably dates, I don't know, from like the 80s or something. I mean, it's old. So mechanically, to comply with current flood requirements, floodplain requirements, given an out-of-date zoning on the land use, how do you resolve those two disparate issues? I mean, I'm kind of assuming that given the zoning that's on the parcel, it might be challenging for them to comply with whatever the current regs are regarding floodplain and still have economic project, but getting a rezone could be a challenge as well. And do you guys see this in other localities, or what's creative? What kinds of creative things are people doing to sort of figure out how to work through some of those issues?
Well, I think the first thing is really understanding what the current flood risk is. If I recall, those maps were done in the 90s, so they're based on the best available information at the time, right, in the 90s, and it hasn't been restudied. So for them to understand what those risks are based on better topo, we have much better hydraulic models these days to understand very complex. That is an area that has been heavily touched by agriculture, so what used to maybe be a stream is no longer a stream. They've moved it around to accommodate whatever land use was needed at that time. And so they've really, it's been heavily influenced by man already. Even though we're not building buildings, it's no longer really in a historic alignment. And so those areas have a tendency to be, from a floodplain perspective, being kind of complex because the water is really unpredictable. If you've got a creek, naturally the water has carved out where it wants to go, and it's really definable. I think in that area west of Santa Fe, it's very kind of difficult to kind of understand where water really wants to go. And so I think the first step is just them understanding, the owner understanding what the flood risks are, and then understanding that yes, it has been heavily influenced by man, and how do we put that in a more predictable state? And I think that's really where we'd like to get we're dealing with a lot of the floodplains in Aurora, out in the Eastern Plains. It's flat, it's large watersheds, heavily influenced by agriculture. What might look like a stream has been realigned so many times to accommodate the farmers and what they wanted to do with the land. And so for us, we want to be a partner at the table to help them guide and let's put this back into a more safe, predictable, sustainable stream network that we can all feel good about, maintain, not have to fight from an engineering perspective all the time, because we've chosen, as engineers, we think we can control nature, and it's really a big farce, is that nature will really teach us the lessons that it wants to teach us, that we can't overcome, we can't overpower nature. So trying to work with it instead of working against it. And I think that in that corridor right adjacent to the Platte are some of the hardest, because they're what's left of the water slowing down and getting to the South Platte River, and working with those streams to have them in a more, like I said, safe and predictable and sustainable manner is what we're really here to help with.
Instead of the wide, shallow flooding.
Yeah.
Instead of the wide, shallow flooding that you have. And I guess I'd like to go back a little bit and talk about when you were talking about what impact does it have on the homes. There's always a flood risk there. And it's just that it gets defined when we do the flood studies. And if we talked about the FEMA one having maybe potential mandatory flood insurance implications. But also, if we have a floodplain and we have a change in the floodplain, we make sure that people are notified. We send out an annual flood brochure to residents to let them know that they're either in or near a floodplain and where they can get additional information for that. But we do have areas where we have local floodplains, but they're not FEMA-regulated floodplains. And one of the problems we've had, or one of the risks that we've had, is that a buyer may not see that on a flood insurance rate map. So it depends on making sure that those people are informed that there's a flood risk there, even if it's not a formal flood insurance rate map, that they're aware that there's a local flood risk. So that's kind of the dilemma we come across. We have people that don't want to, communities that don't want to get a floodplain put on a FEMA map, but then at the same time you have that kind of gray area where somebody may not know that there's a hazard there. So I just wanted to kind of follow up on that a little bit.
Anybody else?
I have one question, maybe two, mainly for Jocelyn and staff. So if a developer comes with a plan that is near a floodplain, impacts floodplain, what are they required to present, and how do we ensure that they have the most up-to-date mapping and information when they present?
That's why we have our experts here. So maybe Fred, if you don't mind, and Carol, you guys can sort of tag team that one. 'Cause primarily when they first come to the city, no plans yet or anything like that. Really, Fred and engineering staff, they're the starting point to how do they start looking at this, and those are the rules that we aim towards.
We'll have a pre-application meeting with the developer who brings in a plan that may be in or near the floodplain, and that's when we make sure, like Terry was saying, they know they have the information that there's a floodplain there, even though it might not be a FEMA floodplain. We make sure they have the most recent information, all the studies, and right up front as they begin their planning and development process, they can accommodate or plan for that floodplain and how they're going to address it on their development.
That's just part of the process that's pretty standard.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and then when they get to a development or a plan submittal stage, Littleton has what's called a special exception permit. That's Littleton's floodplain development permit. So when they get far enough along in their planning process where they have some plans put together, then we refer that plan out to Urban Drainage, Corps of Engineers, Colorado Water Conservation Board to make sure they're accommodating the floodplain in their development according to everybody's standards.
And then that special exception use comes to the Planning Commission for decision for the permit. So that's why we're wanting to make sure. We haven't done one of these since, 2006 maybe? Or?
Yeah, it's been about 10 years since we've done a special exception permit.
That was the last one that we've done. Wow. So wanted to make sure that we bring in the experts. You kind of know the difference between the FEMA floodplains, what the city might have, and talk a little bit in just high level about what the special exception use permit would be, that there is one, and what the process before they can develop anything in the floodplain.
And part of that process is where the communication comes back to the urban
Drainage and flood drainage.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you have an acronym for that? Because we have acronyms for
UDFCD.
that one. So that part of the process is we would have an approval or a recommendation or some sort of memo that says here's what we approve or don't approve coming forward to us, right?
We would send referrals to the Corps of Engineers, Urban Drainage, State Water Conservation Board. It's outlined in the regulations, and they would send us letters, but they would also be looking at not just the project itself, but all the hydraulics that would go along with it. The engineer would have to prepare a drainage report that would show how they're going to be modifying this floodplain along with the site plan, right, Fred?
And so when you have some of this come in front of you, given the discussion we just had about the particular area here that you believe the floodplain maps were done in the 90s, it's very complex. There's a lot that's happened up and down the river. As part of that review process, does that in and of itself create a need for a study on your behalf before you give a position? Or do you just go with the best available information you have, which is 1990?
Right. There have been some developments in that area that we have gone back and restudied because we anticipated that there was going to be an impact. With most areas, we put the onus back on the owner to show us what the existing condition is. So if they, part of this floodplain, the special exemption or the floodplain development permit is they have to show us both what existing is and so pre-project and what their post-project looks like. So they kind of have to say, this is what it is, and this is how we're going to change it. And other than, comparing how those change, and so that we all technically buy into it, so that we know that, again, they're planning for the adequate amount of freeboard, and they're doing something with the channel that we also agree with, and proper management of flows, flood runoff, is all part of that process as well.
And I guess just to kind of piggyback on that, if we had a hydraulic model for determining how deep the water was at different areas, and that was 1990, the developer would come in with, say, an existing conditions that had new topography for the area or existing topography for a pre-project condition, and they would splice that into that 1990s hydraulic model. They would have to tie into that model at both the upstream and downstream end to show that they weren't having significant adverse impacts to somebody else upstream and downstream, and that's part of the National Flood Insurance Program's requirements, the minimum standards. And a lot of times, if it's not causing a rise at all in the flood elevation, they'll have a no-rise certification or something. If there is a rise, they'll be required to put in a conditional letter of map revision. And so there are formal ways of changing the maps that you have to go through an analysis to show what those impacts would be to the community. And that has to be presented to the local government so that they can make a decision on what the impacts are, what adverse impacts are, and how they're going to be mitigated.
One of the, in our citywide plan, we really talk about redirecting our attention to the river, especially when we talk about our corridors and our plans, whereas in the past, those corridor plans were focused on the roads that ran through Littleton. We now recognize the asset that we have as the South Platte River, as well as all of the trails and the Highline Canal, et cetera. And the reason what I'm leading up to is we are very much looking to protect the asset that is the river, but we also recognize that as an asset, it becomes prime property for the right development. And while there was a study done in 1990, what is it that triggered the study in 1990, and what should be the trigger that would say, let's do a study again, as opposed to it being for an individual property or an individual part of the river, again, because it spans our whole city? What should we, as a community or as a city, do to initiate, maybe it's time to do another study?
And I think some of the things that drive having a study done are maybe development pressure in an area that's not that's undeveloped, and so you're wanting to kind of get ahead of that and define where the flood risks are so you can stay out of that floodplain. And then also looking at, if you've got a more developed area, looking at how much has land use changed. You know, how off are our land use predictions compared to what they maybe were assumed to be at the time that the study was done. If development is pretty much tracking with what those land use projections were, then probably the hydrology or the amount of water that is coming into the system is not needing to be revised. If there have been significant developments that were not accounted for, or significant improvements to, say, bridges or culvert crossings or whatever that were not accounted for, then those, you might want to do a study to incorporate that. However, in the past, you could have a lot of those situations where things weren't modified with the floodplain. But now with the National Flood Insurance Program, there's a requirement to have a letter of map revision processed within, or at least started within 6 months after those projects are completed. So you have a lot less of those. We used to have a lot of things in the 80s that were kind of hanging out there that nobody had bothered to follow up on to change floodplains with, and we don't have that as much now. But those would be things that would maybe change a study. Or if we've looked at the hydrology in relation to the gauge data that we have and feel like those numbers are off, then maybe that's something for the community, that maybe the community wants better numbers. We have a lot of floodplain studies that the original studies were done in the 70s. And so,
And we know that they are flawed.
We know that they don't have the best information and didn't have the best tools. So a lot of times doing a study would also be revised at that time at the request of the communities, just to have better information.
And that's a cost that's incurred by the community, correct?
Actually, a master planning cost is incurred by the community. The floodplain studies are typically paid for by the Urban Drainage and Flood Control District.
But they need to, those requests need to come in from the local
From
government.
the local government.
And then we
And there's a 5-year
prioritize
plan
those.
for that. Yeah, the letter goes out every year to communities asking for priorities and requests for updating master plans or floodplains, or as well as a separate list goes out for capital improvement projects and what kind of priorities the community has for those as well.
As a quick follow-up to Karina's question, was September 2013 a 100-year event anywhere in the district? And if so, did we learn anything from that? For example, where the water actually went that maybe surprised us?
A lot of places. Westerly Creek was one of those examples. Up in...
So it was a 100-year event in all of the district or just parts of the district?
No, in parts of the district.
Okay.
So,
In Littleton, it was not a 100-year event.
Right.
Okay.
no,
But in eastern and northern parts of the metro area, I think it even
Boulder County.
exceeded a
Green
100-year
Mountain.
portions of Denver, well, portions of Denver got like a 10-year event and had amazing damage, just astronomical damage occur on
Based
Sand
on
Creek.
that,
And that was only a 10-year, so a 10% chance of occurring any given year. Up in the Boulder, Superior, Lafayette, Erie area, they had what they call a 500-year event come through, which is a 0.2% chance of occurring. So it exceeded the 100-year. We were actually doing a master plan and a floodplain study at the time, and we're able to truth some of that information, and we're able to go back and revise our study, because we were mid-study, to some of the things that we actually saw on the ground. So that was really helpful as well, to see. It was able to tell us that we had missed the mark in some places and we were right spot on with in other places. So areas like, you heard a lot about the Boulder area being hit really hard and having a lot of damage. The verdict, I think, is still out, but they think in a lot of those areas, they only incurred a 10-year event, but had astronomical damage. areas of Aurora were hit by, they were confirmed 100-year event and sustained little or no damage because they had done a lot of flood control projects already through Aurora, yet Boulder kind of is lagging behind on getting implementation of some of those flood control projects in place. So, just it's floodplain management. It's putting your priorities in line with those, with that in mind.
So for the record, Boulder is not perfect.
I didn't say that.
Depends on your perspective.
In all fairness, they have some really interesting, they're on really interesting geology that streams have a tendency to reroute themselves during really big events. And there's only so much you can do. And so I give them that they have some areas that are prone to erosion, and the creek actually did realign itself in several locations, and that really contributed to a lot of the flooding that occurred. So
yeah. They had a lot of flooding and damage to properties that were outside of any delineated floodplains.
Yep, a lot.
Because the creeks moved.
Just because we're talking about creeks moving and things like that, the image that you showed us about Westerly Creek and when it flooded, kind of the blue stream that went through it, was that the floodplain? So is Westerly Creek across the whole floodplain, and was the blue the floodway versus flood fringe? So I'm just trying to visualize what's considered the fringe, the floodway, and the overall floodplain.
Okay, so this is the picture, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was, I don't know.
Do you have that?
The one that you had like the blue running through it?
Yeah.
Yeah, that.
And that's just the floodplain. That doesn't show the flood fringe.
So the floodplain is the blue or the green?
Yes. Floodplain is the blue. And that would be the extents of where you would, where we show the 100-year extents going through that area based on the topography.
And the flood fringe would be where the houses are?
No, the flood fringe is actually inside the floodplain.
Got it. Okay.
Okay,
Okay.
because
Yep.
the
There it
floodway
goes.
is actually more narrow.
Oh, so the whole, okay. Yep.
Yeah, the
That's what I was trying-
floodplain is more narrow, and there are some communities that don't allow any development in the floodplain, so they have like a no-rise floodway type situation. It just depends on, that would be a higher standard.
So the floodway, one of the keys about the floodway is it has higher regulatory standards because it's the area of higher risk. So the velocities are higher, the risk of flooding is more frequent. Anything that you would do in that area would potentially have more of an impact on the floodplain than maybe something on the outskirts, that floodplain fringe where the flow is a little bit shallower. In this picture, it's kind of misleading because it shows, maybe the floodway being so wide and the trees are down in there. We're talking like the amount of hypothetically, you would put a flood wall and fill everything behind the flood wall to a point where the water would only rise 6 inches. So it's not an enormous amount, of change that can happen in that floodplain fringe before that floodway, before the waters in that footprint would rise that much. Does it make sense? So it's to some degree, it's an engineering exercise, but just keep in mind that floodway is really the highest velocities, the highest potential for damage.
And you did mention that some communities do have higher regulations where they completely restrict any development within the floodway. Do you know where Littleton stands on any of this?
Littleton restricts development in the floodway where whatever development they do cannot cause any rise in the flood elevation. In the flood fringe area, they can do development provided they don't increase the flood elevation by more than 1 foot. So Littleton, to mirror what Terry was saying, does have higher standards for the floodway because of the advanced or higher flood risk.
So I don't know if you can see on this map. So this is actually a floodplain in Littleton.
Little's Creek? Yeah.
It is Little's Creek. Well, of course, I had to bring the most controversial one up. I apologize.
So this is going to be your floodway?
That hatched,
The hatched area?
the diagonal hatch area?
The narrower, and this is the floodplain, the dark gray. This lighter area would be the limits of the 500-year, or that has a 0.2% chance of occurring in any given year. So we map the 500-year, we map the 100-year, and then you do have places where the floodplain and floodway are basically the same, or are the same. If there is a design channel or some kind of development through an area that has like a park or something that's already been developed to a point where you're limiting where the floodplain goes, then a lot of times the floodplain will equal the floodway. And that's especially if they've accounted for any kind of flood storage in that area.
So we had partnered with you folks some years ago, a few years ago, in terms of, I don't know, redesigning the Littles Creek floodway, and a lot of that got constructed with, we rechannelized it or some such thing. I guess the question is, are there other projects like that that need to occur in the city that are pending, or where are we with, did Littles Creek get finished 100%, or is there more that should be done, or are there other similar, like Dad Creek or Dad Clark, or what are some of the others?
Yeah, like Terry said, they accept project requests from the local governments. In the next 5 years, Littleton has project requests in to urban drainage to complete or do additional improvements on Littles Creek. So in answer to your question, we're not quite done on Littles Creek yet. We're currently doing some design work near the intersection of Gallup and Peakview. And then we'll hope to proceed to construction on improvements in that area in the next couple of years. And we've also got improvements in design on Jackass Gulch, which is the gulch that parallels West Mineral Avenue east of Santa Fe Drive that you can see down in the valley there. That stream is highly erosive. It's washing away people's backyards, so we're also in design on a project there, and hope to go to construction maybe next year to stabilize that area.
That's the one that runs past St. Mary's.
That's Lee Gulch.
Lee, that's right.
Yeah, Lee Gulch is a good example of the floodplain and the floodway being the same limits, because it's a steep, narrow floodplain, and when you get in those cases, there's not a lot of flood fringe area. It's basically just a narrow channel, like a canyon, for example.
There's nothing we would anticipate needing to be done there, since it is, as you suggested, but it also, it's in a residential area, obviously, but it doesn't, it's pretty much doing what it's already supposed to be doing.
Yeah, it's doing what it's doing, and there aren't very many, if any at all, houses in the Lee Gulch floodplain. So our floodplain management for that stream is basically leave it in a natural condition. When we see localized erosion, go in and repair that, but not do major channel or conveyance improvements like, for example, was done on Littles Creek a few years ago.
Right, okay.
Do we have any existing houses or development in a floodplain now, and where would that be?
Yeah, Littleton right now has over 100 houses in the floodplain. Most of those are in the older parts of town, the northern part of town. Slaughterhouse Gulch basically runs through the area north of Littleton Boulevard, and in some places on that gulch, you can't even see a gulch because they built houses right on top of the creek, and the creek is a pipe underneath the road. Littles Creek is similar. We have quite a few houses in the Littles Creek floodplain just because they developed way back in the 50s when there weren't floodplain regulations in place. But you get to the newer parts of town, we've been practicing the floodplain management that they described, try and avoid the floodplain, and if you have to get into the floodplain, mitigate the impacts.
And so coming back to Little's Creek, because we do have a really big development that's the Grove, that's up the hill, have you looked at whether that development has any impact to this floodplain area? I don't think it ever came in front of us to consider because it's not on the floodplain, but
Yeah, that's
could it?
correct. I think you're talking about the Grove. The Grove is outside the Littles Creek floodplain. It's adjacent to the floodplain,
Yeah.
but it's not in the
It's not in it.
floodplain.
Okay.
So we didn't get into any of the issues of a fill in the floodplain or a water surface elevation rise. That wasn't applicable to that development.
Okay.
But that, if that had been on the land use maps for that kind of zoning, then there would have accounted for in the future conditions hydrology that was used to map the floodplain. So it shouldn't have an impact on the hydrology issues for the major drainage way purposes.
What's the difference between a floodplain and a retention pond?
Okay, a floodplain is typically, you can have a retention pond in a floodplain. But a floodplain is typically the area that's where you've got the moving water. A retention pond is to collect water and then hold it, and it allows it to infiltrate. A detention pond holds that water for a short period of time and releases it at a slower rate. So that it can,
via a dam?
Via, some kind of an embankment and some kind of an outlet structure, like a culvert of some kind, or say a spillway or something, that would release that water back into the major drainage way. And those are used, detention ponds and retention ponds are used to offset the impacts of the development for the very local impact on that particular parcel of land. A lot of times, those small ponds won't have an impact on the major drainage way. They don't really impact the hydrology or the main peak flow that's coming down the whole drainage way, because it's dependent on the entire watershed and the response times to the entire watershed.
So how much dependence should we have on dams, some sort of control structure along, like Bear Creek runs in and pours in here. It's dammed the whole way down with little ponds. Is that an effective structure, effective mechanism to control flooding?
They can be. Some of them.
She's shaking her head, yes or no?
Yeah, they can be. Typically, if we account for them in the hydrology and use them to show a reduction in discharge downstream so that it's protecting and reducing flows as it goes downstream, those facilities have to be publicly owned or maintained, and there has to be some kind of an assurance that that structure is going to, that storage is going to be available, that will remain available. So we don't account for every small private facility sometimes, or private dams. And a lot of times, you maybe used to have an old stock pond or something. If that has been formalized into an agreement where the community has agreed to assure that storage is going to stay in place, whether they do an addition, whether they remove this stock pond and put in a detention facility of some kind or whatever, then those kind of things are accounted for.
Chatfield Dam was created with the intention of being a flood preventer.
Right. It works in series with the Cherry Creek Dam and Bear Creek. So the three of them work together to control flooding on the South Platte.
So our flood risk in the South Platte, the parcels that we were speaking about earlier, in my naive estimation, I would imagine is controlled largely by Chatfield Dam and protected by Chatfield Dam. It would just be the little creeks, the Dad's Creek and the Little Creek and the Bear Creek, that would run in, that would create a flood potential now in Littleton.
Right. That would be outside of the South. There's still going to be a South Platte floodplain, but it may be fairly confined along, where those creeks. It depends on where the creek comes in. but there's typically a floodplain along the South Platte, and then I think in a lot of these areas, the South Platte is fairly well confined to the channel, isn't it, Fred?
Yes.
So then your flooding towards the confluence with the South Platte is going to be due to the local streams that are coming through. So it would be caused by, like, Little's Creek would have the floodplain close to the South Platte would be controlled by Little's Creek.
So if there's a microburst south or north of Chatfield Dam, that could influence it, but largely we can trust that Chatfield Dam would mitigate any Platte River flood
Correct.
Issue coming down from the mountains and all the dams.
Because those dams are all, and they're all monitored by the Corps. They all have specific maximum releases, and they all have to work together to get a certain maximum discharge on the South Platte. So they're controlled pretty heavily. The South Platte is fairly tightly regulated.
And I think through this area of your concern, the vast majority of the South Platte River floodplain is in open space. So it's already been dedicated and set aside for those purposes. So the floodplains that are going to affect these areas are going to be the local drainages, like Dad Clark Gulch, Jackass Gulch.
Littles and Lydian.
Yeah, yep, all of those.
And so the flood risk in Littleton now is quite low, is average, is like we truly have to worry about a potential flood, or we're probably pretty good right now?
You still have floodplains.
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
still have homes in the floodplain.
Yeah, we're real good regarding flooding on the South Platte River. That's really not a risk through Littleton, because like Terry and said, it's either open space or it's in a channel. It's all the tributary streams in Littleton where there's a significant risk, Little's Creek, Lee Gulch, that type of thing. Those are the areas most subject to flooding in town.
I mean, it wasn't too many years ago that Little's was flooding out Stern Parkway, and some of the neighbors down there west of Windermere were pretty nervous about the rise in the creek on rain events that weren't all that, substantial. I think the redevelopment of that thing probably has helped substantially in terms of making sure the flows move, because I think they were backing up because they were bottlenecking. And so part of it depends on what the infrastructure looks like to get some of this stuff. If they do bottleneck, you can have some of those issues.
Lisa, could you talk a little bit about McClellan Reservoir and Jackass Gulch?
I'm trying to find the area.
Yeah, look at this.
Southland.
Here we go. Okay. So.
Yeah, probably, actually. Yeah. That area, Arapahoe High School and stuff like that.
So what I have pulled up on screen is our interactive map that's available. Just go to our website, udfcd.org. On the first page at the bottom, there's a link that goes directly to our interactive maps. And on there, I've turned the floodplains on. These are just the 100-year floodplain limits. Anything that you see in a light blue will show up on a FEMA flood insurance rate map, that gray map that we were looking at earlier. Anything that's in a dark blue is best available information, which would not show, that does not show up on a firm panel. And so this is kind of an interesting, we're talking about Mineral in Santa Fe. This is McClellan Reservoir right here. And it is in a FEMA, it shows up on a FEMA flood insurance rate map. But this is Dad Clark Gulch downstream of that. And it does not show up on a firm panel, but it is in a flood hazard area delineation study that was sponsored by the district and has been accepted by Littleton. And Littleton regulates to those mapped floodplains as well. So not just FEMA floodplains, but other urban drainage mapped floodplains in their ordinance. So even though they wouldn't have to go to FEMA for a conditional letter of map revision to revise the firm panel, they still will have to go through very similar exercise of demonstrating where the floodplain is and how they want to change that.
So since that dark blue is not on the FEMA map, it wouldn't be subject to the increased insurance.
Right, it would not have the mandatory insurance requirement. A lot of times you'll see the dark blue showing up when we have a new flood hazard area delineation study or a local floodplain study that hasn't yet been put on the firm maps or the FEMA maps. Once those, we do have a process. I mean, our goal we would like to have our floodplain map, our local floodplain maps look the same as the federal maps, but we're going to have some areas that are smaller watersheds or smaller areas that are not going to be on a FEMA map, and they do not have that flood insurance requirement. Even areas that we have that are new flood hazard areas that are going to be put on the FEMA map don't have those mandatory flood insurance requirements, even though they'll have the regulatory floodplain that's been designated by the state that you can regulate to for flood management purposes. They will not have a mandatory flood insurance requirement until they become on an effective FEMA map.
When does that dark blue become light blue?
This one is not. This one is
And
not
never
in
will
the
be?
process. It's not in the process now to become a FEMA floodplain right now.
So what, I'm trying to understand what that process is. So how does, how do you distinguish what will become on the FEMA map versus what won't?
Well, it depends on the, FEMA is typically looking at areas that have less than a 1 square mile drainage area. That's kind of been their standard cutoff for a long time. In the urban drainage area or the urban drainage district, the Denver metro area, we have a lot of floodplains that are mapped for drainage ways that are smaller than that. We also have a lot of tributaries that are mapped that are not showing up on a FEMA map. The FEMA map may have the major drainage way, but it may not have some of the larger tributaries. If they're in a flood hazard area delineation study, we work with the communities at the time that those are going to go to, at the time the study is being developed, but also when those are going to be going to FEMA to be put into the flood insurance rate maps to determine whether or not, which portions if there's a portion they're not going to have in the flood insurance rate map. But typically, if we've done a new flood hazard study or a local floodplain study, those floodplains will typically show up on the flood insurance rate maps at some point in the future.
Yeah.
These ones are older ones. They won't.
Yeah, these are the ones that were done back in 1990, and there hasn't been an updated
Right.
study since then, so there hasn't been an effort to get them into the FEMA mapping system.
Right.
So Carol, did we answer your question? Okay, I just wanted to make sure we
I just wanted to make sure
circle
we
back.
talked about it, because everyone was concerned about, the big, Chatfield and everything, but we have
Right.
McClellan right here, and how does that impact?
Well, and one of the interesting things about McClellan is that when this was master planned, they explored using McClellan Reservoir for flood control storage, but because it wasn't built for that, and I believe that's under Inglewood's control. Even though there may be some flood storage there, there's no mechanism to guarantee that it's there. So we, as a floodplain managers, can't account for that. So we have to assume that everything that goes into McClellan comes out of McClellan at the same rate, and that's what these floodplains down here are based on.
Can you show us Little's Creek as well?
Yeah.
Just one thing to just clarify. So even though it's the dark blue isn't FEMA mapped, it is locally adopted. So for our purposes of review and of development, it still has to go through the floodplain processes and make sure that it meets our
it's a regulatory
provisions. It's still a
floodplain.
regulatory floodplain.
It's the purple line.
Highline Canal.
The Highline Canal.
Just to clarify, though, if a case were to come to us, city planning, city engineers would have reviewed that, and they would give us their recommendation based on all of this information, telling us what we can and cannot do.
Yes, that's part of the special exception permit process.
Right.
Goes through them as well, which goes through them as well.
Right, but it's not something that we're going to have to do a lot of research on because they're going to do all the work.
Yeah, that was part of the review process.
You don't have to start going to night classes, is that what you're saying, to learn about
Yes.
engineering? Yeah.
And I apologize for moving away. I did notice, and I wanted to mention to everyone, and there, some people that will remain nameless have a tendency to back away whenever they're talking, and it was really hard when I was watching the last video to hear some people speak.
I'm sorry, he's not mentioning names.
No names.
Andrew?
So this area through here is Little's Creek, and this dark blue area is the area that we're currently working with FEMA to show up on a flood insurance rate map. So
Even though it's been in a flood hazard area delineation study before, it was in one of the earlier ones, it was not shown on the FEMA maps. The FEMA maps, for some reason, stopped at Broadway. So the Littleton portion is down here.
So you're looking to extend that and turn that into a light
We're
blue?
going to extend that into, the light blue area.
This was at the request of the city?
Yes, the city of Centennial. Mm-hmm.
The city of Centennial. Oh, that's the big project that they're doing.
That's the city of Centennial. And this is, the dark blue area in here is the area along Little's Creek that, where you have some homes in the floodplain there.
Where that is.
I have a question on, from development and reviewing it and best practice methods today. And as you said, aiming to create things to be more predictable state in the floodplain. Going back to some of the examples where, like Stapleton, they used to have part of it was piped.
Right.
And then another one was that the development kept the existing floodplain and built
around
or
it,
something
sort
like
of,
that. From just a general best management practices, is there preferred ways that you like to see that development come in? Is it more like the Westerly Creek, or does it just depend and some can be piped, or, we could just speak to that?
We do not condone piping to make development easier. I don't know how else to put that. Channels have at least some secondary predictable, when water exceeds that design amount, there's a place for water to go. When you put it in a pipe and water in a flood exceeds the amount of water that pipe it has, that water has no place to go unless you provide it an adequate location, and that is just not good stormwater management practices.
And in the city of Littleton, so is the city ditch, part of it is in a pipe or underground, especially down by Mineral?
Yeah, the city ditch through Littleton, most of it's been piped, but there's still open ditch sections in the south part of town.
That's not a drainage way.
No, that's an irrigation water supply ditch, similar to the Highline Canal.
So it wouldn't be in any of this mapping?
And typically, for floodplain purposes, we assume that if we're doing a flood study, we assume that those canals are full. And that because they aren't designed to take the amount of discharge for, the entire drainage area, they're typically designed to take their call or their water right. Mm-hmm. And the ditch companies also do not appreciate having stormwater in their facilities because they will end up with uncontrolled spill locations where the ditches can't handle it. So they end up with damage and things from that, unless you have, like in Fort Collins, they have a lot of areas where they have designated spill locations for the canals or some of the ditches that will safely spill excess water back into a drainage way where it's been intercepted, so that you kind of minimize that. But you won't, normally in our areas, you're not going to see a floodplain along the canals, but in our floodplain studies, the canals are assumed full, so we're not accounting on that conveyance in those irrigation ditches.
Beyond Little's Creek, that is, you're bringing it forward for an updated study. Are there any other areas that you're asking for further study on?
Not at this time, no.
Any final questions, comments? No? Okay, great. That was very insightful.
Interesting.
Done
Thank you.
your presentation, or were you?
Oh, we're done.
Well, I didn't know you had stopped in the slides. I didn't know if you had
Well,
gotten all your slides.
No, we got to I think we covered
The
everything.
last slide was question marks.
Yeah, she
It
showed her
was.
little
So I jumped
question
right in.
marks. We're good.
Got to here. No, we were done.
Okay.
We were done. Did you guys, sorry, we kind of stepped over.
No, it's okay. That's great. You were the show, so.
Carol wanted more.
Well, I appreciate your guys' questions and your
Yeah.
interest, and if you ever need anything, please let us know. These ladies know how to get a hold of us. It's probably the easiest for you. And you can contact us directly. But yeah, we enjoy the outreach. We enjoy sharing the knowledge that we are so engrossed in every day with everybody. You want to talk stormwater? We'll talk your ear off. It's my biz.
Well, I think it's helpful to know, when we get some of these packages and who's signed off on, it's good to have this context and background of what goes into it. It gives us also familiarity of some of the terminology that's being used, so we just feel better informed.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Fred has a lot of that information for the floodplain management purposes there, so.
Yeah, most of the information they talk about, we have in our office too. We don't have the fancy interactive map, but we do have all that information.
Great, thank you.
Great.
All right, thanks.
Thanks. You're welcome.
Jocelyn, anything else then from you?
I don't have, staff doesn't have anything else. Are there any other updates from you guys? Any
The
questions?
only thing I will say is we did get a couple of emails over the past, I guess since last time we met. One, at least I received one from Don Bronze and one from Jeannie Erickson. I believe everyone was on both of those. I just wanted to let you know that I did respond to them to acknowledge that we did receive it. And again, just encourage us to take that information. It is part of community input, not through some of the formalized processes, but it is still community input nonetheless. So please take a look at them. In particular, both of them were related to, or some element of commenting on mineral station area plans. So once that comes forward, just know that that's part of the package overall.
Can I ask understood that HPB declined the certificate of appropriateness for Valley Feed. And so that goes to council. It's not coming back to us for any particular reason, as I understand it.
That's correct, yeah. Unless they want an amendment to the PDO. You guys approved the PDO, and remember, as a condition of that approval was that they join the district, and anything that joins the district that wants to build something needs to get a certificate of
But since
historic
they didn't
appropriation.
fulfill that condition, it doesn't
No,
obviate the
the only,
PDO.
no, it does not.
Okay.
No, because really the PDO was, they got a reduction in the open space and the setback in the front, basically.
Parking.
And parking, yes, and parking, thank you.
Right.
That's an
So that
HPD.
was the PDO, and then you had that condition about joining the district. So then they have to join the district. So it was denied. So the options are applicant may appeal the denial, and that goes to city council. Or, so denied, what they do is they can submit a new application with a revised plan and go back through the HPB COA process.
And so what did they decide to do? They're appealing to council? Is that what
No, I'm just saying, those are their options.
They haven't
We're waiting to hear back from them.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
But HPB, you're right, they
But a new
did
plan wouldn't as long as it was consistent.
with the PDO that you approved, yes,
Right,
correct.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because basically, the PDO was a variance to the zoning provisions,
Right.
right? And then you see an illustrative plan, and you gave it some direction based on the design standards that you had to review, but making it that condition to join the district, HPB has a more stricter interpretation of those design standards. And as far as cases tracking, We'll definitely have a meeting February, and I'm trying to recall the date off the top of my head, but I don't know that we have any cases pending for that, but we've got some more potential study session topics for you.
These are good. I think the ones that you've been bringing forward, Jocelyn, again, it's all relevant to some of the things that we're talking about, so it's very timely and relevant, and I think it's
That's
great
the
to do it as great to do it as a study session and be able to answer some of these questions that aren't specific to anything in particular, but more general, so I think that's great. And just from a scheduling perspective, then I think after February 8th, do we get into President's Day weekend? And I'm sure we don't have a meeting, whatever that Monday is, right?
Yeah, I'll follow up with you guys.
Okay.
I mean, we have our meeting calendar.
That's right.
I just didn't bring it, but yeah, we follow that, so.
Yeah, and you took holidays into account when you did that. I noticed that, so.
Yeah, Denise did a good job on that.
All right. Anybody else? Anything? No.
Great, thanks
Great,
very
thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Good to see everyone. Good to see you guys.
Good to see